Karoline Leavitt sat nervously in the waiting room, her heart racing. She was about to appear on one of the most popular talk shows in the country, and she knew it was a huge opportunity. She had prepared for weeks, carefully planning every word she would say. This was her moment to shine, to get her message across to millions of viewers. But as she looked around, she could feel the pressure building. The room was filled with the chatter of other guests, the crew running around making last-minute preparations, and the bright studio lights flashing overhead. Everything felt overwhelming, but Karoline was determined to stay calm. The host, a well-known figure in the media world, had a reputation for being tough and asking difficult questions, but Karoline wasn't worried about that. She had faced tougher challenges before. What made her uneasy was the growing sense of tension she could feel in the air. Something felt off, like the calm before a storm. She had been briefed on the show's format and was told that the host would ask her some tough questions, but that it would be a fair interview. Yet, as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this interview than what was being promised. As the show started, Karoline was ushered onto the stage. The audience clapped politely as she took her seat across from the host. He smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes that made her stomach drop. He greeted her warmly, but the way he looked at her made her feel like she was already being judged. The cameras zoomed in, and the lights grew even brighter, making it hard to focus on anything but the host sitting in front of her. This was real. This was happening. There was no turning back now. "Welcome, Karoline," the host said smoothly, his voice smooth as silk. "It's great to have you here today." Karoline forced a smile. "Thank you for having me." The host nodded, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, Karoline, let's dive right in. You've made some pretty bold statements recently, haven't you? You've been outspoken about your beliefs, and people have started to take notice. But not everyone agrees with you, do they?" Karoline's heart skipped a beat. She had been ready for tough questions, but this one felt like a challenge. The host's tone wasn't friendly. It was probing, almost mocking. He was trying to catch her off guard, to put her on the defensive. But Karoline wasn't about to back down. She had prepared for this, and she wasn't going to let him control the conversation. "Well, I believe in standing up for what's right," she replied calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sometimes that means challenging the status quo, even if it makes people uncomfortable. And yes, not everyone agrees with me. But that's okay. We need to have those tough conversations." The host raised an eyebrow, a sly smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Ah, yes, the tough conversations. You're all about shaking things up, aren't you? But don't you think that some of your views are a little extreme?" Karoline's jaw tightened. It was becoming clear that the host wasn't interested in a fair exchange of ideas. He was here to attack her, to challenge her at every turn. The questions were getting sharper, more pointed, and Karoline could feel the tension in the room growing. She could see the cameras, feel the eyes of millions of viewers watching her every move. She had to be careful. One wrong answer, one misstep, and this could all come crashing down. The host leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower as he continued. "I mean, some people might say that you're just trying to get attention, that you're not really offering solutions, just stirring up trouble. What do you say to that?" Karoline fought to keep her face neutral, but inside, she could feel the heat rising. He was challenging her integrity, questioning her motives. This wasn't just a tough interview anymore. It was a personal attack. The audience was silent, waiting for her response, and Karoline knew that this was the moment that could define the rest of the interview. If she didn't respond the right way, she could lose the crowd, lose her credibility. Taking a deep breath, Karoline leaned forward slightly, meeting the host's gaze. "I don't think standing up for what I believe in is about attention. It's about making a difference. And if that means challenging the way things are, then so be it. I don't apologize for that." The host's smile faltered for just a moment, and Karoline saw the first hint of uncertainty in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, launching into another question. Interesting. But do you think that your approach might be a little too aggressive? Some people might say you're not exactly playing nice with others in the political world. Karoline knew that the host was trying to goad her, trying to make her angry, to get her to lash out. But she wasn't going to take the bait. She had been through tougher situations before, and she wasn't about to let him get under her skin. I believe in being honest, even when it's uncomfortable, she said firmly. And sometimes the truth isn't pretty, but that doesn't mean it's not important. The host didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat back in his chair, staring at her with a look of disbelief. The room seemed to grow colder, the silence thickening as the tension between them grew. Karoline could feel the pressure building. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a battle of wills, and the outcome was still uncertain. As the minutes ticked by, the questions grew more pointed, more personal. Karoline's nerves were on edge, but she refused to let the host see it. She had a message to deliver, and she wasn't going to let him distract her. The stakes were high, and she knew that this interview could change everything. Would she be able to stand her ground, or would the host's mocking tone finally break her? The tension in the air was palpable, and the audience was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see what would happen next. It was clear now that this interview wasn't going to be easy, and Karoline's response would determine whether she would leave the studio with her head held high or whether she would fall into the trap the host had set for her. The tension between Karoline and the host continued to simmer as the interview pressed on. Karoline could feel the heat rising, not just from the lights above, but from the hostility coming from the host. His voice had taken on a sharp, mocking tone, and he seemed determined to rattle her. The subtle smile on his face made it clear that he didn't expect Karoline to stand her ground for much longer. The pressure was mounting, but Karoline wasn't backing down. She could sense the moment was slipping away, and she knew that one wrong move would be all it took for everything to come crashing down. As the host's questions grew more personal, Karoline could feel her patience wearing thin. The host wasn't interested in hearing her views. He was only interested in getting a reaction. He wasn't asking about her policies or what she stood for. Instead, he was digging into her personal life, questioning her every decision, and mocking her past. Every time she answered, he seemed to brush her words aside, trying to turn her response into something trivial. Karoline, the host said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "You've been very vocal about your beliefs, but some might say you've made a career out of being controversial. Isn't that true? Isn't it all just a game to you?" The audience seemed to hold its breath. Karoline's heart beat faster. This was no longer just an interview about her political beliefs. This was an attack on her character. The host's words stung, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. She had been in far worse situations, and she wasn't going to let him get the best of her now. Taking a deep breath, Karoline met his gaze head-on. "I'm not here to play games," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "I'm here to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people feel. My views may not always be popular, but I'm not afraid to stand up for what I believe in." The host raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her calm response. But he wasn't going to let her get away with it so easily. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "But don't you think your approach is a bit too abrasive?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're constantly fighting with people, calling out others, making enemies. What happened to playing nice, Karoline? Isn't that what's expected from someone in your position?" Karoline could feel her blood pressure rise as the host's words struck a nerve. He was trying to paint her as a villain, as someone who thrived on conflict. But the truth was far different. She didn't start the fights. She simply refused to stay silent when others pushed her into a corner. "I don't believe in playing nice when the stakes are this high," she replied, her voice rising slightly. "When you're fighting for what's right, you can't always be polite and docile. The world isn't going to change if we just keep quiet and hope for the best. Sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, even if it means making enemies along the way. The host seemed to falter for a second, but he quickly recovered, flashing a smug smile. I see. So you think that stirring the pot is the way to make change? Karoline's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. She wasn't going to let him turn her into some sort of media villain. She wasn't the one who started the conflicts. She was just the one standing up against them. It's not about stirring the pot for the sake of it, Karoline responded, her tone sharp now. It's about standing up for those who don't have a voice, for those who are too afraid to speak out. I'm not here to make people like me. I'm here to make people think. If that makes me controversial, so be it. The host looked at her, his eyes calculating. He seemed momentarily caught off guard by the strength of her response, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms, clearly not satisfied. You talk a lot about standing up for others, he said, his voice growing colder. But don't you think your words are causing more division? You're dividing people, Karoline. You're making things worse, not better. Karoline's expression hardened. She could feel the room's eyes on her, the cameras capturing every moment. But it didn't matter. She knew what she was doing, and she knew why she was doing it. The host's words were meant to provoke a response, to get her to admit that she was wrong. But she wasn't about to fall into his trap. I'm not here to make everyone agree with me, Karoline said firmly. If you believe that the only way to create change is by keeping everyone happy, then you're mistaken. Change doesn't come from making everyone feel comfortable. It comes from challenging the status quo, from asking the hard questions, and being unafraid to stand up when it's needed most. The host sat back, his eyes narrowing. He had expected Karoline to break, to crumble under the pressure. But she wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted. Instead, she was standing tall, unwavering, refusing to let his mockery get the better of her. The studio audience was silent, waiting for the next move in this battle of wills. Karoline had proven that she wasn't going to back down, no matter how hard the host pushed. But the host wasn't done yet. He had one last question, one that he hoped would finally crack Karoline's composure. He leaned in once more, his voice low and almost threatening. You're standing up for the voiceless, Karoline, he said slowly. But what about your own voice? What if your message is being lost in all the noise? What if you're just as guilty of creating division as everyone else? Karoline's eyes flashed with determination. She knew that this was the moment. She could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air, but she wasn't about to let him win. With a calm, measured voice, she responded. My message is clear, she said. It's not about division, it's about truth. And the truth is something that people are too afraid to face. I'm not creating division, I'm exposing it. If people can't handle that, then maybe it's time they start listening instead of pretending everything is fine. The host remained silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Karoline had managed to stand her ground, and the audience could sense that. For a brief moment, there was a shift in the air. The host, who had once seemed so in control, now seemed unsure. Karoline had made her point, and the tension was palpable. But the interview was far from over, and there was more to come. What would happen next? Would the host escalate, or would Karoline continue to hold her ground? The room was charged with anticipation, and everyone could feel that the best was yet to come. The host sat back in his chair, a smug expression on his face, clearly enjoying the back and forth. But Karoline wasn't done yet. The tension in the room was reaching a boiling point. She could feel it. The moment of reckoning was near, and the way she responded now could either make or break the interview. The audience could sense the unease, the shifting power dynamic between the two of them. She had taken the host's jabs, stood her ground, and now she wasn't backing down. For a brief second, the host glanced at the producer offstage, as if looking for guidance on how to proceed. But Karoline didn't give him the time to gather his thoughts. She knew that the next move was hers, and she was going to make sure it was powerful. The host cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Karoline, "You've made your point," he said, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. "But let's talk about something that's been on everyone's mind. Some say your rise in politics has more to do with your ability to stir up controversy than any real substance. What do you say to that?" The question was calculated. He was trying to bait her into a defensive position, but Karoline was prepared. She could feel the weight of his words, but she knew they were just an attempt to undermine her success. He wanted her to admit that she was nothing more than a media spectacle, a pawn in the game of political entertainment. But Karoline wasn't having it. "Stirring up controversy," Karoline repeated, raising an eyebrow. "If speaking the truth and standing up for what I believe in is controversial, then I guess I'm guilty. But let's be clear here. I'm not in this for attention. I'm in this to make a difference. If that makes people uncomfortable, that's their problem. I'm not afraid of speaking out, even if it goes against the grain." The host's smile wavered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He wasn't going to let her have the last word, not without one final push. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he launched into the next attack. "But do you really think you're making a difference, Karoline?" he asked, his voice almost condescending. "Or are you just adding to the noise? You've been involved in so many controversies. You've made enemies in every direction. How can anyone take you seriously when it feels like you're more focused on being the center of attention than actually creating change?" The room seemed to grow colder as the host's words hung in the air. The audience was waiting, hanging on every word. Karoline could feel the heat rising in her chest. The host wasn't just questioning her actions anymore. He was questioning her very integrity. But instead of letting the anger consume her, Karoline stayed calm, taking a deep breath. She wasn't going to let him paint her as some attention seeker, because that wasn't who she was. "Creating change doesn't always look pretty," Karoline responded, her voice calm but firm. "And sometimes it means making people uncomfortable. People don't want to hear the truth because it forces them to confront things they'd rather ignore. But if I'm going to make a difference, I have to speak up. I can't worry about who I upset along the way. If I only said what people wanted to hear, I wouldn't be doing anyone any favors." For the first time, the host's confident demeanor faltered. His expression shifted from smugness to something more guarded. Karoline's words had struck a nerve, and he didn't seem prepared for the strength of her response. The audience could feel the shift, the power slowly moving back into her hands. Karoline had not only defended herself, but she had also managed to turn the tables, forcing the host to confront the very idea of what it meant to stand up for one's beliefs. The host cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "You're a strong woman, Karoline, there's no doubt about that," he said, his voice tinged with something like respect. "But don't you think your approach is a little too extreme? You're alienating people who might otherwise support you." Karoline didn't flinch at his words. She had heard it all before. People said the same things about anyone who dared to break away from the norm, to challenge the system. But she wasn't here to make everyone happy. She was here to make a change. "Maybe," Karoline said, her voice calm but full of conviction. "But I'd rather be true to myself and stand by my principles, even if it means losing support. The people who are truly meant to follow me will do so because they believe in the message, not because I'm trying to be popular. If I'm going to fight for change, I can't afford to compromise on what's important." The host stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The audience was silent, waiting for the next exchange. Karoline had handled everything he had thrown at her with strength and grace, and now it was clear that the host was struggling to maintain control of the interview. "Let's talk about something else," the host said, finally breaking the silence. His tone was more neutral now, almost reluctant. "You've built a reputation for being unapologetically outspoken. But do you ever worry that your words might have consequences you're not prepared for?" The question was softer, but Karoline could tell it was a trap. He wanted her to admit fear, to acknowledge that she was walking a dangerous line. But Karoline wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. "I'm aware of the consequences," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But every decision I make is intentional. I'm willing to face the consequences because I believe the message is worth it. I didn't get into this to be liked. I got into it because I believe in something bigger than myself." The host looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. The tension was thick in the air, but Karoline held her ground. The host might have thought he could break her, but he had underestimated her strength. The audience, sensing the shift, leaned forward in anticipation. The next move was coming, and it was clear that Karoline had the upper hand. Would the host escalate, or would he finally recognize that this was no longer his show? The battle for control had begun, and it was far from over. The atmosphere in the studio was thick with tension. The host had tried to provoke Karoline, but instead of breaking under his pressure, she had only strengthened her resolve. The audience, once tense and uncertain, now seemed to lean in closer, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. Karoline wasn't just answering questions anymore. She was taking command of the interview, and it was clear that the host was struggling to keep up. The host took a deep breath, looking over at the producer once again. Karoline noticed the brief glance but didn't let it distract her. She wasn't about to be swayed by his hesitation. If anything, it only proved that he was losing his grip. He was trying to find a way to regain control, but Karoline was in the driver's seat now. She had taken every jab he'd thrown at her and turned it into an opportunity to speak her truth. "Karoline," the host said after a long pause, attempting to regain his composure, "you've said that you're not here to make people like you, but don't you think that's a dangerous approach? Don't you think that in a world that's so divided, you should be working to bring people together, not tear them apart?" The question was more pointed than before, but Karoline didn't flinch. She had heard this kind of rhetoric before. The idea that standing firm in your beliefs automatically meant you were contributing to division was something she was used to hearing from those who couldn't handle the truth. But she wasn't going to let it derail her message. "Division isn't created by people who speak the truth," Karoline responded, her tone firm and unwavering. "It's created by those who refuse to face it. People don't like the truth because it challenges the comfortable lies they've been told for so long. If we keep trying to make everyone happy, we'll never get anything done. The truth has to come first, and if that means upsetting people, then so be it." The host's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he sat back, as if considering her words. The silence in the studio was deafening. The audience was watching, waiting to see how the host would react. For the first time since the interview started, it felt as though Karoline had the upper hand, and she was using it to her advantage. Finally, the host broke the silence, though his voice seemed more subdued than before. "You say you're speaking the truth, Karoline," he said. "But the truth is subjective, isn't it? What you consider to be the truth might not be what others believe. How can you be so sure that you have the right answer when there are so many different perspectives out there?" It was a calculated question, designed to make her doubt her certainty, to plant seeds of doubt in her own mind. But Karoline wasn't easily swayed. She had spent years refining her views and understanding her stance. She knew her truth was grounded in what she believed was right, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. "Truth is subjective to a point," Karoline said, her voice steady. "But there are certain things that are undeniable. We can argue about the details, but when it comes to core principles, honesty, integrity, fighting for what's right, those are things that are non-negotiable. If we keep accepting falsehoods just because they're convenient, then we've lost our way." The host seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure of how to respond. It was rare for anyone to stand up to him like this. Most of his guests either became defensive or tried to soften their words in an attempt to placate the audience. But Karoline wasn't doing that. She wasn't playing the game. "Karoline," the host continued, trying to keep the momentum of the conversation, "you say that you're fighting for what's right. But in doing so, Don't you risk alienating the very people who might be on your side? Don't you think it's better to meet in the middle, to compromise for the sake of unity?" Karoline's expression remained calm, but her eyes flashed with determination. "Compromise is important, but there are some things that can't be compromised," she replied. "When it comes to standing up for people's rights, for truth, there can be no middle ground. I'm not here to meet in the middle with those who want to silence others or push harmful agendas. I'm here to stand up for what's right, even if it means facing opposition." Her words rang out in the studio, and the host didn't immediately respond. It was clear that he wasn't prepared for this level of resistance. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the host would try to regain control or if Karoline would continue to steer the conversation. But the host, sensing that his usual tactics weren't working, leaned forward again, his tone changing. "Karoline, I have to ask," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he was testing her. "How do you deal with the backlash? How do you handle the criticism when so many people think you're too extreme?" Karoline could tell that he was trying to get her to break, to show vulnerability, to admit that the pressure was getting to her, but she wasn't about to fall for it. "The backlash comes with the territory," Karoline said. "I know that not everyone will agree with me, and that's fine. I didn't get into this to be liked or to make people comfortable. I got into this to make a difference, and if that means taking criticism along the way, then I'll take it. Because in the end, it's not about me. It's about the message. And the message is more important than anything else." For a long moment, the host didn't say anything. The air in the room was thick with the weight of Karoline's words. The audience was silent, hanging on every moment of this intense standoff. The tension was palpable, and everyone knew that the interview was nearing its climax. What would happen next? Would the host finally give up, or would he escalate the confrontation? The next few moments would determine the direction this interview would take. The host seemed to reconsider his next move, taking a deep breath and studying Karoline carefully. The interview had reached a critical point, one that neither of them could afford to misstep. Karoline had remained calm, poised, and confident through everything the host had thrown at her, and the audience was clearly on her side. They were invested now, and they wanted to see how this showdown would end. The host, clearly sensing that his usual tactics weren't working, shifted gears. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk in front of him. His voice lowered slightly, but there was a sharp edge to it now. "Karoline, you talk a lot about standing up for what's right, about fighting for truth. But what happens when that fight makes you unpopular? What happens when people start questioning your integrity, accusing you of being nothing more than a political spectacle?" Karoline didn't flinch at the insinuation. She had heard these kinds of accusations before. Politicians and public figures alike were often labeled as spectacles when they became too vocal or too unapologetic in their beliefs. But Karoline had no intention of backing down. She was here for a reason, and the truth was her armor. "Being unpopular is part of the job," Karoline responded, her tone unwavering. "If you're not willing to stand firm in your beliefs, no matter the consequences, then what are you even doing? I'm not in this to make friends or to win a popularity contest. I'm in this because there are things that need to be said, and there are people who need to hear them. If that makes me a spectacle, then so be it. But I'll never apologize for speaking the truth." The host's face tightened as he absorbed her words. For a moment, it seemed like he didn't know how to respond. But then he quickly regained his composure and attempted another push. "But Karoline," he said, his voice raising slightly in a final attempt to regain control of the narrative, "aren't you worried that, in the end, all this controversy will only harm you? That you'll alienate more people than you'll inspire?" Karoline could feel the host's desperation to shift the conversation in his favor, but she wasn't about to let him dictate the terms of this interview. She was done defending herself. Instead, she was going to turn the conversation back to where it mattered, the larger issues at play. "You can only alienate people who aren't really listening to the message," she said, her voice calm but firm. The people who are truly paying attention will understand that this is bigger than any one person. The fight I'm fighting is about making a real lasting difference. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how uncomfortable it makes others. If people can't handle that, then maybe they're the ones who need to take a step back and reevaluate their priorities. The host, for the first time, appeared slightly taken aback. He opened his mouth to speak again but seemed to hesitate, as if he was unsure how to continue this line of questioning. The tension in the studio was palpable, and it was clear that Karoline had gained the upper hand. The audience could feel it too. They were hanging on every word, waiting to see how the host would react. For a long moment, there was silence between them. The host seemed to weigh his options, realizing that his usual tactics weren't working. It was clear that Karoline had outsmarted him at his own game. She had shown herself to be not just a political figure, but a force to be reckoned with. The host had tried to box her into a corner, to force her to defend herself against attacks, but instead, she had turned the tables. Finally, the host sighed, his posture sagging slightly. "You're a tough one, Karoline," he admitted, his voice almost begrudging. "I'll give you that. But tell me this, what's next for you? After all this controversy, after all the battles you fought, what's your next move?" Karoline didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what her next move was, and it had nothing to do with her personal reputation or the media circus surrounding her. It was about the people she was fighting for, the change she wanted to bring to the world. And that message wasn't going to get lost in the noise. "My next move is to keep fighting," she said firmly, "because the fight doesn't stop here. I'll keep pushing, I'll keep speaking the truth, and I'll keep standing up for the people who need it the most. This is just the beginning. If you want to see what comes next, just wait. The real work is yet to be done." The host nodded, clearly realizing that he wasn't going to get the soundbite he was hoping for. Karoline had not only held her ground but had also turned the interview into an opportunity to reinforce her commitment to the cause. He had underestimated her, and now he knew he had met someone who wouldn't back down, no matter how hard he tried to provoke her. As the camera light blinked, signaling the end of the interview, the host leaned back in his chair, looking at Karoline with a mixture of respect and something else, perhaps recognition of her strength. Karoline stood tall, unwavering in her belief that she was doing the right thing. She had made her point, and the message was loud and clear. The interview may have ended, but the impact of what Karoline had said lingered in the air. The audience had witnessed something powerful, a woman who had refused to be silenced, who had turned the tables and used every attack against her to reinforce her mission. As Karoline walked off the stage, she knew that the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more obstacles, and more moments where she would have to stand firm. But she also knew one thing for certain. She was ready for whatever came next. The fight was just beginning. The host's final words hung in the air as the camera crew began to pack up. The studio was still buzzing with tension, but there was a sense of anticipation now. Karoline had proven herself to be a force to be reckoned with. The way she handled the entire interview, staying calm, unshaken, and firm in her beliefs, had left everyone in the room, including the host, with a sense of awe. This was not the typical interview people were used to seeing. As Karoline stood up to leave, she was met with a few quiet nods and glances from the crew. They had watched her navigate through the storm with grace, and they could all sense that something significant had just occurred. The interview was more than just a clash of ideas. It had been a moment of true power and conviction. Karoline had not only defended herself, but she had also conveyed a message that resonated beyond the studio walls. Back in the green room, Karoline took a seat, her mind already racing. The host may have tried to disarm her, but in the end, she had stayed true to her purpose. She wasn't just a guest on a talk show. She was an advocate for change, a voice for those who had been silenced, and she had no intention of backing down now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she quickly pulled it out to see several messages from supporters. friends, and even a few colleagues who had been watching. The buzz on social media was already picking up, with people praising her for her strength, her calmness under pressure, and her unwavering commitment to her values. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from her close friend and mentor, someone who had always been a guiding force in her life. The message read, "You were incredible today. You didn't just answer the questions. You turned the interview into your platform. You've made your mark. Keep going." It was exactly what she needed to hear. She wasn't in this for the applause, but in that moment, the recognition meant something. It reminded her why she was doing all of this. It wasn't about winning debates or collecting followers. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't the easiest path. As she left the green room, Karoline knew that the aftermath of the interview would be intense. She expected criticism, as always, from those who didn't agree with her, but she had already prepared herself for that. The bigger battle, the one that truly mattered, was the one she was already fighting. The fight to bring truth to light, no matter the consequences. Back at the studio, the host sat in his chair staring into the distance. He couldn't deny the respect he now felt for Karoline. She had shown him a side of her that he hadn't anticipated, and in doing so, she had won more than just the interview. She had gained an audience who respected her for standing firm, for refusing to be moved by the pressure around her. As the production team wrapped up their post-show discussions, the host found himself replaying the interview in his mind. He had tried to go for the jugular, but Karoline had not only parried every attempt, she had countered with the force of her own conviction. It was a lesson in resilience, and he knew it. Outside, Karoline made her way to the car, her thoughts focused and clear. She was ready for whatever came next, more debates, more challenges, and more opportunities to speak her truth. The world might not always be ready for it, but she was prepared to keep pushing forward. The next phase of her journey was already unfolding. Every moment, every interview, every step she took was part of a larger mission, a mission that would continue, no matter the obstacles in her path. As the car drove off, Karoline glanced out the window, a small but determined smile on her face. She knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it. Because sometimes, in the face of adversity, all you can do is stand tall and keep moving forward. And that's exactly what she was going to do. As the days passed after the interview, Karoline's name spread like wildfire across news outlets and social media platforms. The initial shock of her powerful words began to wear off, replaced by a growing respect for her unwavering stance. The interview, which had started with tension and subtle jabs, ended up being a pivotal moment for her. She had shown the world what it looked like to stand firm, to fight for what you believe in, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Her inbox filled with messages, some of admiration and support, others critical of her approach. But Karoline wasn't fazed by the criticism. She had anticipated it. It was the price that came with standing up for what was right. As she read the messages, she could hear the voice of her mentor in her mind, urging her to keep pushing, to keep speaking her truth. More interviews came in the wake of the talk show, some with sympathetic hosts who understood her message, others with those who were skeptical. But Karoline had learned from the first encounter. She knew how to handle herself. She was ready for whatever came her way. One evening, as she sat in her apartment preparing for yet another interview, she received a call from a close ally in the political world. They were excited to inform her that her message had begun to resonate far beyond her original circle of supporters. There was even talk of her being invited to speak at major events, where her voice could amplify the change she had been advocating for. Karoline wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. She had always been focused on the cause, on the people who needed a voice. But she understood that the spotlight was now hers to wield. If she could use it to shed light on the issues she cared about, then it was worth stepping into it. That night, as she looked out at the city from her apartment window, Karoline thought about the journey that lay ahead. She wasn't just facing criticism from a talk show host anymore. She was up against a system that had long been resistant to change. But she had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. The road wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments where she would have to defend her beliefs, more people who would try to tear her down. But Karoline was ready. She had already proven to herself and to the world that she was willing to fight for what was right, no matter what it took. As she prepared for the next phase of her journey, Karoline made a promise to herself. She would continue to stand tall, continue to speak the truth, and continue to be the voice for those who didn't have one. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The fight was just beginning, and Karoline Leavitt was ready to take on whatever came her way. The spotlight was hers now, but more importantly, the message she carried would shine brighter than ever.